here came 3 airplanes from the mountains. Well, these weren't American planes. They were Japanese planes. They were using the same DC-3 pattern that we were using. Well, a bullet hit me in the back. My name is Harold Kitchen. I was born on January 7th, 1923, in the little town of Blanca, Colorado. It's in the south central part of the state.
Harold, you were attending 11th Airborne.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. I was called a cryptographic technician. I was in the Signal Company. The Signal Company consisted of 3 units. There was the wire unit, where they laid wire and ran telephones, and they had a telephone system. There was the radio unit. They used radios. They had had a number of kinds of radios. We had small radios that were good for a few miles, and we had one SC-199 radio that we could talk to Washington, D.C. from Manila. And we had what they called the message center unit, and I was in the message center unit. Now, if I get a message, we didn't originate any messages. We get them, you write the message and we deliver it. That's what our job was. We had classifications of messages. When you get an urgent top priority message, you take it to that officer right then. We had heard that it was going to be a dangerous affair. So Helso was about as far from me as you are. The gliders have a bench seat. There's no seat belts or anything, just a bench seat. Well, there's 17 men on the 2 sides, divided up, 8 and 9, one on each side, one side, and 9 on the other, because there's a door. So we're sitting there, and we've heard it's going to be a dangerous affair, and I foolishly gave, well, what kind of flowers you want for your funeral? Not a wise thing to say, but I was saying it. And he was saying, no, I'm going to send flowers to your funeral. Well, here comes some radio men, and they had a package of radio tubes, and they tied it down to the floor, right in front of my feet. And I couldn't put my feet on those radio tubes, and I was trying to put my feet somewhere. And Captain Atwood looked and said, you get in that glider. So I got out of that glider and I got into the other glider. Well, the glider that I got out of was towed by an airplane, and that airplane had motor trouble. So they didn't warn. There's a telephone line. There's a 300-foot long line tied to the glider, and there's a telephone line in it so the airplane can communicate with the glider. They didn't tell them. They just dropped them from the airplane. So here's this glider going along, and he's got a 300-foot rope hanging on his nose. Well, if that rope hooks a bush or something on, they're going to flip that glider. They're going to be in very bad shape. Well, Captain Hoyt was in there, and he managed to get rid of that rope, so they didn't have that. Then they looked around, and they found they could see over. It was a moonlight night. They could see a field. Oh, I think we can go in there. So the glider went in. Of course, once you choose the glider, you're committed. There's no second choice. Yeah. And they got there, and it wasn't a field. It was a logged-off area. So, and it was all stumps. So, of course, they hit a stump when they went in there. And the men come sliding forward, and Helso was the first man, and they all slammed against him and slammed him up against the edge and killed him. So an hour after I was talking to him, he was dead, and I didn't feel one bit proud of my conversation.
Making those comments, right?
It was not a good idea. I got hit. I got a Purple Heart. Our captain had given me a job that day. Their headquarters it rained 23 inches the first 30 days. We were in Leyte, so we had water everywhere. And there was a mud hole in front of the office where he had a tent for an office. And he didn't order me. He asked me, can you dig a ditch and get that water flowing? Yes. I worked all day and I got that ditch flowing, and the water was flowing away from the tent. They could walk in. Well, there was a well there. There was a a grassy field there, and there was a well there, and it was clear, good looking water, but they ordered us not to drink it because, anyway, there were a dozen or more of us out there. We were dipping up water and taking a bath. I had soap down with GI soap, and I was going back with my helmet tied on a rope. I was going to dip up some more water and water. And here came 3 airplanes from the mountains. Well, these weren't American planes. They were Japanese planes. They were using the same DC-3 pattern that we were using. The paratroopers started coming out of those planes. And there was a parachute, came down about as far from me to that woman that's over there about that far away came a parachute. Well, I could see it wasn't a man, it was an equipment chute. And I had never been a combat soldier. I was a messenger, I wasn't. So I had my carbine, and I fired at that thing. I knew that was foolish. I shouldn't be firing at it, but I was excited, and others were firing at it. Well, a bullet hit me in the back, and it spun me halfway around. Well, I just went to the hospital, and they sent me off to the hospital, and I spent 6 months in the hospital, and when I got mended, they sent me back. They took the airfield that night, and I slept in a shelter. There was water running underneath me, but it was okay. And then the next morning, the Americans came back in, and they took it away from the Japanese. They only held it about 24 hours.
You also share one of the stories in your book how one of the code book has been compromised.
It was early in the maneuvers, and we didn't have any real complicated codes. We just had codes that you write out on. And they said, well, if the enemy has your code book, you got to get rid of it. So they signed me, and I sat on the ground all night long, and I wrote out new code books for everybody. And I don't think it was very well done. I was sitting on the ground with a flashlight and writing. I had to make my own code. You want to make a code, you write down the alphabet, ABC, down. Then you write down your name, Alex, A-L-E-X. And then you go on down and you fill in the code book. A, you've already got A, so you go clear to the bottom. And then when you write your message, you put these mixed up letters in, and then they can read it over. That's a simple way to make a code, and that's the type of thing I did.
So you look at the letters, but you can't really tell the message. You wouldn't know unless if you know how to read the code.
We went into Japan 4 days before they signed the treaty. So we were in Japan 4 years. We're still at war with Japan. So suppose I get out on the street and I kill a Jap. So what? We're at war. Suppose he kills me. So what? But neither side wanted to face that possibility. Japan was all bombed. It was just, everything was bombed. There wasn't any building taller than my shoulders. The Americans had bombed it, it had burned, and the Japanese who were still alive, they'd pulled together some roofing and crawl under it, and that's all they had. So I see this Japanese officer over there, and he said, come over. And I wasn't going to go over. He's a Japanese. I don't obey Japanese. But he was asking me. He wasn't ordering me. And I looked at him, and he said, why aren't you burning and raping and looting? We would. And he was sincere. He wanted to know, and I failed to tell him why. I should have said, because our God says, do good to your enemies. I didn't tell him that. I failed. I said, oh no, we're not barbarians. We don't do things like that. I never should have given him that answer. And he had medals both sides of his chest. He was a high-ranking officer. I sure should have given him a better answer than I did. First night we got into Leyte, we were on the beach, just camped on the beach, and there was an aerial battle out in the bay. Out there we could see the Japanese planes and the American planes. Well, this Japanese plane it was flying, and all of a sudden it was just going down. They shot it down. It went into the bay, and I knew that fella never lived, and hooray, hooray. Then I got thinking, I shouldn't do that. That's the end of a man's life. So he's an enemy, but I still shouldn't be cheering about his life. I was wrong for doing that.
While you were in the Philippines, were you able to talk to your wife, or?
It took about 2 weeks to get a letter home. I could put a letter in, and in about 4 weeks I'd get an answer. It'd take her about 2 weeks to get it, and then she'd write back, and that'd take me about 2 weeks to get them. That was the most contact we had. She was a shipyard welder. While I was overseas, she was building ships. And they put a ship in the water every 23 hours in Portland. Now, I don't mean...
One ship every 23 hours?
I don't mean they build a ship in 23 hours, but they're building all these ships. And every 23 hours, they put one in the water. Now, one of them was the Drew, D-R-E-W. And when on December the 5th, 1945, I boarded the Drew in Yokohama Harbor. And I rode it across the Pacific, and I got out at Tacoma, Washington on December 22. So we were 17 days coming back. And she had a battle. I need to tell you about her battle. She was a welder. She was put out in the yard welding, and she was with a crew, and there was what you call ship fitters. Now that job is self-descriptive. The steel comes in as flat plates, and then it goes out with all kinds of bends and stuff. So it's their job to make that steel fit that place. And once they get a plate in place, then it's her job to weld it. Well, they showed her this weld that didn't fit. It was 2 inches off, and they wanted her to fill that space with weld. Well, she could do that, but it would have been a weak weld. If that ship gets put under stress, it's going to break there. And she refused to weld it. So they fired her because she wouldn't work. And she said, I knew that if I left, they'd just send in another welder and they'd get the weld made. So I sat down. I wouldn't work, and I sat down so nobody else could work. Nobody else could get there. And different people came by and fired her. Finally, somebody come by who really had authority to fire her, and he had enough brains to look at what she wouldn't weld. And he said, you guys fix that. So she fought a battle.
She probably knew that on one of the ships you might have to come back.
She knew that.
She wanted to be sure you're safe, huh?
Yes, yes.
How long did that take for you guys to travel from Philippines back home?
It took us 17 days to come home from Yokohama. It took us 28 days to go from California to New Guinea. The reason it took us 28 days, they told us we were the first ship without a convoy to protect us. And so we went way south. We went south of New Zealand. We wanted to stay away from the Japanese ships. It was an old luxury liner that had been in service before the war as a passenger ship. They converted to military use. And the bunks were 5 high. Now, if I'd get in that bunk and lay on my back, I was okay. If I turn on my side, my hips would touch the guy above me. So, we were pretty tight.
Wow, it's pretty small, huh?
We were pretty tight.
Wow. One more thing I was going to ask you. Would you be able to tell us some of this?
There's a glider. There's a Purple Heart. George Washington gave that one out to people who had been hit, injured, wounded in war. I started back with George Washington.
Well, Harold, thank you so much for sharing your stories.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to share these stories.
No, you've got some wonderful stories.
I'm kind of disjointed, but we got through.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a nice book. I strongly recommend to my friends to read this book.